Okay, it's okay.
Good afternoon, guten Tag. I am Christel JongeVos. I have been one of those kids waving at Gail, hoping to catch a chocolate parachute, which never happened, but that is part of my interview. So I was born in Berlin right into the war. In 1939, I was 1.5 years old. I was 2.5 years old, and my sister was 1.5 years old. We lived in an apartment in Berlin on the top floor, 4 stories high, which became pretty crucial during the bombing nights when we had to reach the cellar quickly. My father was sent to war immediately after he had refused to divorce my mother, who was partly Jewish. In 1943, as the bombings became worse and worse in Berlin, women with children were evacuated. The ones who had relatives in the country could go and live with them. So did we. My father's sister and her family lived on a farm way up north from Berlin, close to Rostock at the Baltic Sea. They had 2 children and our age and 1 baby. The uncle was a Nazi, which we didn't know and found out quickly. And we were not very much liked because this uncle knew my mother was not pure Aryan. That uncle especially didn't like me. And when I screamed and said I didn't want to see a pig being slaughtered, he forced me to watch the whole ordeal. From that day on, I never ate meat again, and I still don't. We were also not very much liked as refugees, having little to show for. All was left in Berlin. My mother couldn't carry that much, and we children were too small to carry anything, really. Then I turned 6, and I had to go to school. There was only one schoolhouse, 2 miles away. A wonderful, wonderful teacher taught 6 grades in 1 room. And believe it or not, I learned to read and to write before I turned 7. Wonderful instruction. I had a boyfriend. Boyfriend was 12 years old, had a bicycle. And he let me sit on his bike and ride with him to school, so I didn't have to walk 2 miles. But one day he said, okay, bye-bye, I'll see you later at the house. I said, what? Let me climb on. No, you walk today and have fun with wild pigs, because there were wild pigs in the woods. So I panicked and ran the whole time until I reached the house. Thank God there were no wild pigs meeting with me. What was really scary was every night we heard this boom, 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 boom. That was the Russian front coming closer and closer and closer. And one of the Russian farm workers who were captives and had to work for my uncle, my Nazi uncle, said to my mother one day, soon we will be at where you live, in that beautiful house, and you will live in our cottages. That taught my mother a lesson. She packed one suitcase, we didn't have more. And we took the last train to flee from the Russians coming closer, to go to Marburg, which is next to Frankfurt, about a day's train ride. So that was the best decision my mother ever made. When the Russians then came to the farm, my uncle had no choice, I think. He shot all of his 3 children, his wife, and then himself, because he would have been tortured and hung from trees by the Russians. Very tragic. So we took the last train to Marburg, to Oma's house. Oma had a nice house and she had enough room to have us. There were also bombings day and night and day, and we spent more time in the basement than upstairs. And one night when we sat in the basement, actually it was early morning, there was no bombing anymore. And my grandmother said, I think the war is over. I have to go upstairs. My mother, why do you have to go upstairs? Don't do it. I have to put out a white sheet. My mother said, no, you can't do that. And my grandmother was determined, put out a white sheet, and sure enough, the war was over, and we heard this noise of approaching tanks. So tank after tank after tank would roam the street we lived on. There were at least 30 to 50 tanks, and the noise was just something else. So what puzzled me was the men on those tanks had dark faces, really dark. So I thought, oh, these poor men must have gone through the fires because the houses were still burning from all the bombs that fell. And I thought, oh, those poor men. And later on, I found out we had Black occupation. All Black soldiers was our occupation. So that was my first encounter with a different race. These people, these soldiers were wonderful and very nice to us children. I got my first piece of chewing gum from one of those soldiers. One more incident, we had curfew, of course, and the MP would watch us meticulously. We couldn't be out at night. So one night there was this ring at the door, and one of the MP soldiers said to my mother, Frau, komm. My mother panicked, but she had to go with him. So at gunpoint, he guided her upstairs a ruin which was across from our house, but the staircase was still intact. So he led her upstairs all the way, then all the way downstairs, then accompanied her back home and said, good night, lady, and gone he was. We found out that the American soldiers were afraid of people who may have hidden in the ruins and may have had weapons to shoot. So my mother was used as a shield. Next night, another ring, doorbell ring, the same soldier. And this time my grandmother opened. My grandmother was able to speak English. She said, good evening, sir. And he said, good evening, ma'am. This is for you. And he presented her with a package with food. And food was something we really needed so badly. That was his ration. From then on, he came every single night and brought packages with food until the end of a week when my grandmother said, I think this is going a little too far. We're not going to switch on the lights. We're not going to open the door anymore. And that was the end of food for me. And I could never understand why my grandmother did that, but it happened. So that was how we experienced the end of the war and a little bit after the war. And then we moved to Berlin in 1947. And my father had just come home from Russian from Russian captivity. And this is what we found in Berlin. And the following is what Gail Halverson and Lucius Clay saw and experienced and made them say, what have we done, on their first flight to Berlin, looking down at the ruins. The war was not over when it was over, and things did not become all better for several years to come. The only thing that had changed was that no more bombs were falling on our heads. It was a life of sheer subsistence and starvation. By the middle of 1947, 2 years after the war had ended, the daily ration was 2 tablespoons of vegetables, 2 tablespoons of meat, 1 small potato or a rutabaga, 2 slices of bread, a small slice of cheese, and occasionally some sugar. I remember students protesting and holding up a placard that read, even dogs need 1,700 calories. I was now 10.5 years old. People died from malnutrition, and many were diagnosed with tuberculosis. My mother came down with a serious case of jaundice, which kept her in the hospital for many weeks, not years. The clients of my father, who lived on farms on the outskirts of Berlin, paid him with potatoes, eggs, and vegetables. And he gathered what was given to him under his desk in a wastebasket until there was time to go upstairs after his office hours. See, he had a law practice in the house downstairs, and we lived upstairs. One day, and that was always the greatest time of the day. When he came up, we asked, what did you get this time? One day he came up with a big sack filled with grain. What do you do with this? It had to be ground. My parents used a hand coffee grinder, and that was really hard work and took forever. The ground grain was then cooked in water, not broth. There was no broth, and became kind of an awful tasting cereal. We mixed it with radishes and any spices we had. This became our staple food for many months. From newspapers, we learned that the British occupation force acknowledged that the German civilians' death rate for adults had risen to 4 times the pre-war levels, and the death rate amongst German children had risen to 10 times the pre-war levels. Head lice were as common as diarrhea and carbuncles. My poor sister had head lice, and she had to suffer from us making fun of her head lice. But there was nothing we could do about it. Chronic hunger had made people's senses fuzzy, and their reaction slow. Often I saw people standing in the middle of an intersection, confused and fearful. And when I asked them where they wanted to go, they didn't know. Some couldn't even remember their address. Others staggered through the ruins, still looking for relatives and under the rubble. Mothers were staring at me, asking me whether I had seen their child, and some would just sit there on the rubble pretending to rock their baby. Many people would mumble constantly, as if they were talking in tongues. And so many men with only one or no legs tried to crawl to get somewhere. There were no crutches. People, mostly men, would walk around aimlessly with this hollow look, piercing stare in their eyes. I knew they were not looking at me. It was, however, eerie and frightening to see that. One would constantly say, "Nach Hause, nach Hause, nach Hause," going home, going home, going home. And often I passed by people who were lying motionless in the ruins as if asleep. They had died from hunger, as did my aunt. When we went through the ruined streets, there was this dreadful silence, only interrupted by cries here and there from people who went crazy. I remember a woman who constantly said, "should, should, should," which means ruins, 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 or debris, debris. And then another one said, "Feuer, Feuer, Feuer," which means fire, fire, fire. Suicide rates were high. My parents tried hard to protect us all from that, but I was too old by now to see and hear what was going on around me. And then, what age was I when I heard about the candy bomber? And did I ever catch a parachute? I was about 11 years old when the blockade began. I never knew about a city that was not ruled or occupied by 4 allies. We Berliners lived sort of on an island surrounded by the Russians. While we Berliners worried about hunger, the Americans, British, and French squabbled endlessly with the Soviets. On June 16, the Soviet city commandant walked out of the weekly meeting of the 4-power body that officially ruled Berlin. He said that there will be no more meeting, typically Russian. That was it. With this, the 4-power rule of Berlin had ended. Stalin would not agree to Allied currency reforms and a step towards unification and reindustrialization. On June 24, we read in the newspapers that the Soviets would halt passenger and train freight traffic, as they said, because of technical difficulties. We further read that electrical power supply as well as water supply from the Soviet zone and the Soviet sector would be stopped, also due to, as the Russians said, technical difficulties. My father was up in arms and said, "This is it. There will be a blockade." How come, I asked. Well, every day, many millions many million pounds of supplies had been brought into Berlin to us 2.5 million Berliners who live in the western sectors. This had been done by river, rail, and roads. Now we're cut off from food, clothes, medicine, coal for energy and heat. But, they said, they are having technical difficulties. Maybe they just have to repair things for a few days, I said. Ha ha. Now, my father said, no, this is serious. You cannot trust the Russians. But what about us? We may have to leave and go to West Germany. But how if no trains or buses are running? We will have to walk. Walk? Yes. And if we stay, we will either die from hunger or have to live with the Russians under communism. But the Americans, what about them? They will help us. I know they would, but I don't think they can. Too much is needed. Imagine having to feed and care for 2.5 million people. Even if they wanted to help us, it would be impossible. I did not want my father to see me cry, but when he left to go to his office, I ran into my room, hugged my Peter doll, and thought that this was just like war again. We heard of American troops making a show as to reassure us, and the atmosphere was just like in 1945. We read that General Clay spent a full day of troop inspection in the American zone. We were on edge. Will there be war again? That evening at the dinner table, my mother and my father discussed the question which were on everybody's mind. Will there be enough food, and will the Allies stay or leave us with the Russians? He assured us, General Clay, no, that was my father. And there was nothing said about any help on the radio. So we all went to bed silently and worried. But the next morning, the British Colonel, Frank Howley, addressed the Berliners through an interpreter. He assured us that the Allies, and as he said, are going to stay and will not allow the Berliners to starve. My mother's face lit up and she said, "See?" My father shook his head doubtfully and said nothing. Except for my father, my mother, my sister, and I were relieved and hopeful. Little did we know, but much did we hope for and wanted to believe. From the radio and newspapers, we heard that General Clay had said, the Soviets simply want to scare the Berliners and Western powers into capitulation, and the Russians cannot drive us out of Berlin. But we had our doubts when my father said that it would be impossible to supply West Berlin by air alone, the only way of transportation left. My father said, and if Clay just meant there will not be a war over Berlin, and eventually we'll realize that a retreat from Berlin will be the only way not to have all of us starve to death. The only answer was no answer. We were frightened and in limbo. Frequently, any one of us started to think about what to take if we had to flee from the Russians and walk to West Germany. This time it would be over the green border, which meant walking several days through the woods to West Germany, which was so far away. My first thought was Peter Doll and what book to take. We then heard that Truman had said, "We are in Berlin by terms of an agreement, and the Russians have no right to get us out." True and correct. But we knew what the Russians could and could not do. They could care less about agreements. Meantime, for the very first time since the bombing raids of the war, we heard the humming of airplanes at night. The airlift had begun and was on a 24-hour schedule. Listen, what do you hear? What do you hear? There are airplanes bringing food, I exclaimed while barging into my father's office. We ran upstairs to tell my mother and sister, who were sound asleep. "See, I told you," my mother said, "they won't leave us to the Russians." What difference this airplane sound made in my life. So far, when I heard one approaching from far away, I ran into the basement. Now I ran outside to welcome them. The first version of the airlift was a very small beginning. It was bringing only a small fraction and far less than what Berlin needed, even on severely cut back rations. Although I could see that my father was somewhat relieved, he told us he had planted even more of these awful radishes, cabbage, and even some potatoes, and urged us to keep weeding and watering. And I said, "Well, we now have the airlift and the Americans will bring food." "Well, we will need it," he said. "They may be able to keep us from starvation for a little while, but not for long. And in a matter of less than a month, our food supplies will be exhausted," he said. Well, that was my father. And so the airlift had begun, and then we heard, I'm fast forwarding now. There is much more and more details to be read in my books. So then we heard of parachutes with chocolates and the man who threw them out of his airplane for children. We called him der Schokoladenbomber. And after school and homework, we hopped on whatever was available in terms of buses to get to Tempelhof to see him wiggle his wings and drop chocolates. And there we saw him wiggling and the little packages coming out of his plane. First, there were only about 15 children, but day by day, more and more came to wave to the pilots and to our Schokoladenbomber. I have never been able to catch a parachute. Too many kids, and the boys being always faster. But that was not important. Important was that good feeling we had when going to Tempelhof and seeing the upbeat, smiling pilots bringing goods and often waving back at us. And that there was one who dropped chocolates for us was so precious. We war kids, and now experiencing the crucial meager after the war years, had not experienced anything like that. a human being caring about us children the way the Schokoladenbombe did. Tempelhof became sort of a little paradise in the middle of rubble, death, and tears. Plus, there was a young man from heaven, so to speak, turning little things, 2 strips of gum, into big things, dropping chocolate. And this made all the children who were there or even heard about it happy, and laid the ground stone to what was later said, enemies became friends in Berlin. The friendship has now lasted for over 7 decades. I'm glad to have been able to visit and shake hands with Gail on my visit to Arizona, November 2014. And I took, and you may remember or not, I took this opportunity to hand him a replica of the wreath, which I made from flowers from the ruins, but I couldn't get it to you back then, so I had another one made and gave one to you in 2014 in Arizona. This shows that the events during the airlift and our Schokoladenbombe's small things become big things have made a seed grow into a big tree, bearing humanity, empathy, and sympathy. May this tree, planted by you, Gail, continue to spread its branches all over the world where there are and were wars. And one more thing, my generation Berliners are airplane crazy. That may have caused by the ongoing landings and takeoffs during the airlift, which meant life and hope for us. The blockade and the airlift had also a great impact on us being a new, upcoming, young generation, having experienced humanity, love, and empathy coming from our new friends, the Americans. This may have contributed to my move to the US in 1972, when I followed my German husband to live here. Thank you, dear Gail, my beloved Schokoladenbombe. And this is all in a nutshell. Detailed description of World War II and the post-war years and the airlift and the wall are covered in my trilogy, Pathways Away from the Edge. Thank you. So glad to see you, Gail. Gail, you look so wonderful. You must be 10 years younger now. From 100, you go back, right?
Yeah, my goodness, lady.
Now you're 90.
Sure good to see you.
So good to see you, yeah.
Sure, lady.
I wished I could come.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, I have been in the hospital 2 months ago, and I have a little problem with my heart, which can be easily treated with medication. But I consider myself high risk, and I don't want to be on an airplane. And I hope you understand. And I am so sorry and so mad that I can't go, but my children don't want me to go. Stefan and Gion, his wife, they will be there.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's his wife's name?
Gion. Jeeyeyon. Jeeyeyon. She is Korean. They want to be there. But I mentioned that I need airplane tickets, and maybe I am high risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I hope I get a wonderful report.
Oh, you sweetheart. Wonderful. Good to
Yes,
talk to
you
you.
will. You will get it.
Sure enjoyed being with you.
So do I. God, it's so good to see. I wish I had a picture of all that.
Well,
But I can't, this can't be reproduced or something. So, yeah.
Well, I think we're going to try to make a video
Yeah,
so we can share that with you.
you're sunshine.
wonderful. Is Mercedes coming?
No,
Yeah.
no, none of the Germans are coming.
Well,
From the ones overseas are not coming.
it's overseas and it's a virus. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not wise at all for them to come. So,
But you will have a big reception, right?
well, we're going to have our family and a few guests. So we have just our family alone is going to be 86.
You do that.
Big family.
Is your family from Arizona coming too?
Well, let's see who's
Your
next.
wife?
No, we don't have anyone. His wife Lorraine lives there.
Lorraine, yeah, is Lorraine coming?
No,
No.
she can't come either. She's confined in her assisted living.
Oh no! I'm glad you got him out of prison. You got him out, right?
That's right. He wasn't really happy about it, but he's glad now, I think.
Yeah.
You know, when I was in the hospital, nobody could visit me. It was the most horrible time I've ever been through, and I still have nightmares about it.
Oh, really?
It
Wow.
was terrible, terrible.
Well,
Wow.
how long were you in the hospital?
5 days hospital and a good week of rehab, and both were
Well, when did you come to the United States then?
1972.
Oh, yes, I think you did say that.
That was before the wall came down, but I was there when the wall came up. That was another nightmare when we didn't know what to do, whether we had to flee again when the wall came up. That was in 1961.
So
Yeah.
when the wall came up, where were you living then? Were you back at your apartment on the 4th floor?
I was in Germany then,
Wow.
in Germany.
Oh,
I lived in Berlin.
Yeah. Wow.
yeah, but was your family on the 4th floor of that apartment?
That apartment got bombed. Yeah, that's another story. It's in my book. The apartment got bombed in 1944 or what. And my father went back in 1947, 48, just to look at the ruin. And guess what he saw? The piano was standing on the ground, totally intact. It must have fallen from the 4th floor down to the ground. So my father had someone help him to transport that piano to where we lived, and it's still there and still playable.
Oh, my word.
Oh,
Amazing.
That's the piano story.
That is a good one.
That's one of my books.
I love the story of the doll, you with your little
Peter doll.
Peter doll. Yeah.
Did you read that?
Yes, I did.
Peter doll tells you a lot about the war. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter doll is still alive, and every Christmas, Peter doll sits under my Christmas tree.
Oh, that was a very, very good way to tell the story through the eyes of a child, through the doll's eyes, and it's beautiful.
I was tired of saying I, and I thought I need a third person.
That's good.
But you are a very accomplished woman, a musician, a poet, a playwright.
You know, that is the only way to survive, to be active,
Mhm.
tribute.
Yeah.
And I've been given some talents and not just for nothing, for being proud and brag. No, make something out of it. That's what my parents told me. Make something out of it. Go to work.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
That sounds like you learned from them and they gave you great advice.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Wonderful.
But I am very humble about what I received, and I hope I live a few more years. I really have to, because I have so many plans. There's so many other things to do. Don't you agree, Gail?
What are some,
How is flying? Are you still flying?
What?
are you,
Are you still
Oh, yeah.
flying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, still flying.
God, I love airplanes.
Yeah.
We have this airplane museum close by, and I go there and I feel like I'm back in Berlin. I look all these airplanes and talk to the old guys who have been in World War II, and then we have a ball.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Good,
Airplanes are fascinating.
good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
so tell us, what are some lessons you learned from that time? I mean, can you separate out lessons you learned from the experience of where you were living and from the teachings of your parents? It probably all goes together, doesn't it?
Yes. This has been the most fruitful time of my life, to listen to my parents and follow their advice. That's all I can say. If it wouldn't have been for my parents, I would have been very boring.
I'll say.
Nothing would have happened. I wouldn't have written. I wouldn't have played music. Nothing really. It's my parents and my upbringing and my forefathers. I'm just part of a line.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have 2 children.
I have a boy and a girl. Boy and girl, they're getting, you know what? My children are getting old. So are my grandchildren. Marcus, my son, works for Apple in California. He is now, I think, 46. And my daughter is 48. She works in healthcare. I have 4 grandsons, and I love them. 26, he is a pilot, yes. 22nd, getting his bachelor's degree, and 18, and I forgot my oldest, my favorite grandson, Stefan, who is 32, who is the composer, yeah, who lives in Los Angeles and making, hopefully, a career as a musician, composer. And he composed that work for Gail.
He's written a symphony about you.
Oh, my word.
Her grandson, Stefan, and you'll meet him at your birthday.
Oh, my word. Fantastic.
Yeah, and I hope he's going to have it performed there. I haven't talked to Stefan, I haven't talked about it. Every time I mention it, yeah, Oma, that will be done, that will be. So I can't ask that many questions. Because I push him about it, because I heard part of it and it is so good. It's really good. Yeah.
Well, I talked to somebody at the Utah Symphony, so I hope they're going to contact him to maybe premiere here in Utah. That would be so nice.
Premiere in October for his birthday?
No.
If that gets premiered, I am going to come.
Yeah.
Whether the children like it or not,
Good. Wow.
I'm going to come. Yeah, because Stefan and I are very close. I helped raising him.
Good.
Yeah, and that really created a good bond, and it was part of my life.
Does Stefan have a sibling?
Stefan
Does he?
no. Stefan is an only child. The other 3 are my son's kids.
Okay.
And Stefan doesn't have any children yet. And they, they say, we are the forgotten generation. We have to pay student loans, and we just don't have enough money to raise a child. And who wants to have a child? So they don't have a child, but they have careers. They are very career oriented. Fine, that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm happy. And what about you, your children? How many, well, great grandchildren do you have?
How many do I have?
You have 24 grandchildren
24,
Oh my gosh.
and 60 great grandchildren.
60 great grandchildren.
And they're all coming?
Oh, no.
Not all, 86 are coming. 86 from our family are coming.
Wow, that's neat.
Yeah.
No. How nice. So you're planning to meet in a big hall or?
Yes.